tonight, and we're going on with our next part in Ark Apologetics, specifically the animals. I'm going to guess most of you probably don't follow MMA fighters, I'm going to guess. But one really popular saying that they have these days is, if you're going to fight, fight like you're the third monkey on the ramp to Noah's Ark, and it's starting to rain. Which is... While somewhat humorous, and we're not actually going to be talking about fighting, that does bring us into the animals and them going in the 2x2, the one male, one female, or also of the clean animals, there were the 7 and 7. So while it is in that account that was read for us, so thank you, John, he was commanded to bring of the animals, the birds, the creeping things. Many today think that this must be some kind of exaggeration, or just that this must be a moral fable as opposed to a historical account. From that, we're going to look into 3 big questions that they have about the animals. First, how did they all arrive at the ark? Second, how could all of those animals fit into the ark and it float them and their food? And then third, how then did all of the animals end up where they are now, and which animals that we have today? So the biblical account, as they read it earlier, is a little vague on details for our first question tonight. It says there in 6:19 that you shall bring into the ark, and in 7:2 Noah was told to take with you, and then there in 7:9 that the animals went into the ark as God commanded. Now, for Christians, that's all the detail that you need. The Bible is the authoritative word of God, and when God commands something to be done, you do it, or there's consequences to pay. Elisha told the axe head to float in 2 Kings 6, and the bear to eat the mockers earlier in 2 Kings 2. And Jesus commanded the waves and the storms to be still in Mark 4, 35 to 41, but no details were given as to how these were carried out. Did Elisha change the specific gravity of the axe head so that it would float, or did he lessen gravity, or bending of some other natural law, or did Jesus influence a warm front to come in and balance out the storm, or did he dissipate the clouds with wind? It didn't really matter to the story. The Bible isn't a science textbook, so it wasn't included. The point of the story that God needed to convey was. But so detractors and disbelievers, since they don't believe in this reasoning, they want to go in deeper. And so we're going to look at some of the proposals put forward by apologeticists over the years. And again, I say proposals because there's a lot that is in reasoning, but it's not in the Bible definitively as to which way it happened. So looking into their first question, there we go. There you can see a map of the world today. You see, skeptics love to point at, say, the 3-toed sloth over there that has the arrow pointing to Brazil on the map behind me. If you said God had the animals come to Noah, the thing is that sloth today moves at a whopping 0.15 miles per hour, and also can't swim. So there would be some trouble there. Also, you have the penguins, which are widely scattered all over the world. There are some that exist only on the Galapagos Islands, which are there off the northwest coast of South America, but then there are also some that are only in Antarctica, like the Gentoo penguins, which are both rare habitats. So if Noah was going to gather the animals together, that would have been quite the long journeys, as he was based there at Turkey, the blue circle in the middle of the map. Much less other animals that people love to point at, such as the koalas of Australia or lemurs in Madagascar. All of these are found only in a few places and very far away from Turkey. And it wouldn't have been quite so easy for him to go out, because as we mentioned last time, building the ark is a very large, labor-intensive project, probably the biggest one that anybody had seen at that point. It wouldn't be like he could just pop out for a weekend trip or an hour road trip in his Lexus or something down the road, or even if he had a bullet train or something, it would still take quite a while to get to each of those places and gather them. Plus, if he did them a little here and a little there, that's that much longer he would have had to feed and take care of them before the flood. The thing is, this view has some flawed preconceptions, as was mentioned this morning about the timeline scale. They tend to believe that humans are relatively recent, so any stories about humans wouldn't have involve the world as it was in its original state, such as with the continent or the supercontinent of Pangaea, as you see on the slide behind me. Basically, just at the beginning, all of the continents went together as a puzzle piece in one piece before they were split apart. Everybody I've seen on both creationists and scientists side tend to agree that this was the state at some point. Then the argument just becomes as to when was the split. But having everything all on one landmass does make it that much easier for everything to be able to reach Turkey in the middle, as well as not have to, cross oceans to get to it. Also, the other big thing is that in the account, you'll notice John used the word kinds, is how the Bible translates there, as to the types of animals. We'll go into that in a lot more detail in a couple of minutes. But then the other preconception here is that, he had to build all of the ark himself and collect all of the animals himself. As we mentioned last time, he could have hired workers either to work on the ark or sent out zoological expeditions if he wanted to. But honestly, the most common amongst creationists is that they're from in verse 20, where they shall come unto you. I had always kind of taken that to mean that they were coming with him onto the ark at the loading, but it's apparently also fairly common that people mean that God had the animals come to Noah at the ark, and so that's the general interpretation of how did the animals get there. But in any case, it doesn't seem as difficult as they purport it to be for him to get the animals. That's the main point that we're trying to make here. So then moving on to question 2, how did all of the animals fit into the ark? I don't know, probably seen at some point or another, one kid or another playing with these sets and having some trouble fitting all of the animals in. Maybe if they're being a little bit greedier, they have some other toys that they want to stuff into, and it's like, well, that's a good question. How did all of those fit in there, after the giraffes, the lions, the dinosaurs, the camels? But so as we know, the ark had 3 decks, and the area of each would have been 300 by 50 cubits. And from the last time that we were talking about the ark itself, we learned the closest vessel we know and have detailed information about to that size is the Liberty class of cargo carriers during World War II. They had a carrying capacity of about 16.1 thousand tons in order to carry troops, tanks, and supplies during World War II to the landing at Normandy. And this is quite a large carrying weight, because after all, a lot of the big animals we have today to load on, such as the Asian elephants, those would have been about 4 tons each. That's the one up the edge in the pictures. And then there's also the African elephants. They're a little bit bigger, about 6.5 tons each. And dinosaurs like the T-Rex were around 10 or 11 tons. The Brontosaurus is about 25, or the largest one there in the picture is the Argentinius huencalensis, and I'm sorry for the pronunciation on that, but fossils have been found in Argentina recently. It's believed to be the largest and is projected to be about 88 tons. And while these were the largest, they wouldn't have been the only individuals on the ark. Many other skeptics like to point out that, there are a lot of insects in the world. There's several different species of those, and looking at beetles alone, well, while I'm sure Joe would say there's only 4 beetles worth saving, the ones from the band, there's actually about 400,000 different species of beetles today. So if Noah was going to take 2 each of those, and I looked it up on Wikipedia, the average beetle apparently weighs about 115 grams. So to take 2 each of every different species of beetle would have taken up about 88 tons of weight on the ark by the time you add all of those up. And that's without the ants, the spiders, and everything else. Although, one thing to note in argument to that is that not all creationists believe that Noah actually took insects on the ark. That one was a little bit new to me in my study here. They interpret Genesis 7:22, where it says that everything with breath and nostrils died, to mean that since insects breathe through spiracles along the abdomen, that then, they were fine on their own, that there could have been floating vegetable mats or something large enough to hold them up, and that they didn't have to be counted in the ark. But in any case, whether or not he did, there are today about 1.5 million different species. And apparently, I looked it up, the average weight of a species is about 23.5 kilograms. So if you had 2 each of every species, that would weigh you about 39,000 tons. And that's without food. So something isn't adding up. Clearly, kind in the Bible doesn't mean species that we have today. As we said, there's, go to the next slide. There we go. So on the one side, our current way that we divide animals, called the taxonomic system, came about in about 1750, goes from most generic to most specific, from domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, all the way down to species. And while the guy who made it, actually species is the Latin translation of the word for kind, it clearly isn't going to work in our term for kind. In the Bible, the only kind of classification used is the word min for kind. Or also, as we learned this morning, bara, meaning created, is often used in conjunction with it as created kind. It's looking at where all it's used from Strong's Hebrew Concordance. There's not a whole lot of places. It's used in Genesis 1, referring to, God created them each after their own kinds to reproduce. It's used again here in the flood account in what animals to gather, representatives. Moses uses it again in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14 in talking about what kinds of animals that the Israelites could eat. And the last place it's used is in Ezekiel 47:10, where it's used in regards to fish. And I'm sure, Jim, you'll get to that in class there in another couple of months when you get that deep into Ezekiel. But also, there is one in the New Testament, which while it wasn't written in Hebrew, they seem to have a similar word, phusis, which James uses in chapter 3, verse 7, to describe birds, animals, creeping things, things of the sea, and man. And so the most helpful of these verses is kind of coming in from the creation account, where each kind needs to be genetically fruitful. This helps indicate that, a kind is not species, because there are different hybrid animals we have today. You can put a horse and a donkey together and get a mule, and while that doesn't then create more animals, there are other hybrids that do, such as in Searcy, where Michelle and I went to school. One of the things to do in town, because town is very small, some farmer had a zonkey. He had bred his donkey with a zebra, and so that was something to do, because it was the middle of nowhere, Arkansas. It was pretty different to see. So, but the fact that you're getting these kinds of hybrids and then means that you're not going to be species being the kind. There are some other examples that are listed, such as a jag lion, such as between a lion and a jaguar, or a growler bear. Apparently that one happens in the wild. They've found some, and then they've even had kids where you have a grizzly and a polar bear whose ranges overlap, and they'll get together. Or there's some others. But then also, the accounts in Leviticus needing to specify that ravens, hawks, and kites are separate kinds, and that grasshoppers and crickets are separate kinds, or locusts and bald locusts are separate kinds, shows us it's not a term we can just use to include as many animals as we want in order to get a really easy number to fit. So then looking into, what is a kind then? John Kotz wrote in his studies in creation that, the Bible is written in terms that were written for a wide variety of people to understand. It's not a specific science textbook. And from these accounts, it seems that it means a group of animals that from the time of creation to the flood could all procreate and could breed within themselves. And journal33.org adds that, it probably is somewhere around genus or maybe a little bit higher, because of those hybrids that we mentioned. And let's see, also the devotional biology, learning to worship the creator of organisms, further adds it that there couldn't have been that many kinds, as Adam named them all quickly as God was looking for a helper for man before Eve was created, there between Genesis 2:7 and verse 22. The kinds to be named must have had high similarity within themselves in order to be highly recognizable, and also high difference between kinds to be easily recognizable. And they kind of tend to put it around family, as there are, interestingly, there are some intergenus hybrids as well. There on the screen behind me is an orchid, and again, if Joe was here, I'm sure he could tell you the fancy flower name for those orchids that are up there. I'm not even gonna try. They're such a mouthful. But so since there are still producing hybrids at the genus level, and we can't find any at the family level, that's probably more likely where kind would be. So then looking from, okay, if a kind is equal to a family, how many would you have to have on the ark then? Is that a feasible number? Well, today I looked up, there's about 20,000 different taxonomic family units. So that's a lot more manageable than 1.5 million. But each year, more animals go extinct, so it's possible that that number could have been higher back then. Whitcomb and Morris suggested maybe about 35,000, but LaHaye was thinking maybe about 50,000. But so, you know, me being an engineer, this was a lot of fun for me to study with math. I'm going to try to keep this a little higher level because Michelle was warning me that I was going to cause some eyes to glaze over tonight. So, you know, if you look at that carrying capacity in the ark, well, actually, rather than that, there was a study published about 10 years ago. The Church of Scotland put it out, that where they had a group of engineers study, you know, how much could the ark have carried? They used Archimedes' principle of buoyancy to look at the ark. You know, a big vessel in the water pushes out and displaces water, so then all that water pushes back up at the boat, how much it could have carried by its displaced water. And they found that from the dimensions of the ark to be about 50.54 times 10 to the 6th kilograms. You know, rather than looking at similar boats today, that was what they decided to use. And before you say, well, but we don't know what the ark was made out of, as we discussed last time, it's most linguistically similar to Cyprus, so they used the density of Cyprus for their numbers. And again, they used the average mass of an animal, as we mentioned earlier, of about 23.5 kilograms. So the ark then could have held, you know, they think about 2 million-ish animals there, but it's not just they had to put the animals in for one day and then they had to get them back out. So looking at for the food that they would need, I looked at the Idaho Rangeland Resource Commission. Apparently an herbivore eats about 2.5 to 3% of its body weight per day. So projecting out for up to a year, just so they weren't out of supplies when they landed the ark, you know, that would be roughly around 11 times its body weight in food for each animal that you would have needed in the ark. So that's going to cut down from your about 2 million animals down to you could have had maybe a little under 90,000 kinds of animals. Again, however, you know, God said clean animals, you have more. You have 7 pair instead of just 1 pair. But using that same math, you end up with somewhere at its bottom number about 13,000 kinds. So somewhere in between there is, you know, what the ark could have carried. But you know, we don't know exactly how many of them are clean, so it's somewhere in there. And also, that's not taking into account any kind of water that they would have needed to drink. Although, one last note on kinds before we move on. The Ark Encounter in Kentucky, in building theirs, also set out to see what a kind is. There you see on the screen behind me, instead of starting from families, they started with the number of land-based vertebrate species alive today, and then working backwards by those methods on the screen, they land at about 1,400 kinds. And then with clean animals, you could have had up to maybe 7,000 animals, which I'll grant you is a much more manageable number when you're talking in terms of 8 people on the ark, feeding, watering, taking care of, exercising during the flood. But it's good to me to be able to know that no matter which of the interpretations you believe, it seems the ark would have had enough buoyancy to carry that many animals and their food. And so then looking just at the volume inside the ark, this one's kind of a harder question to answer because we don't know what the original representatives all were, so we don't know how much space they would have needed. And how much activity they would have needed in the ark in order to stay healthy. Because, I mean, after all, you or I can sit in one of the chairs here tonight that's, maybe a meter by 2 meters tall, but would you want to sit there? I mean, I get antsy at the end of a plane ride after 5 or 6 hours. I wouldn't want to sit there in that for a year. So, they would have needed some kind of volume to be able to access them or get out and exercise them, as well as to bring them each their water and food. So we don't have any kind of record in the account there as to how it was laid out, other than that there were rooms built. But again, in building their Ark Encounter, if you're curious, they do, there you can see it, and they have a virtual model as well of how they would put together their 7,000 animals that they project on it. I couldn't find a similar model for the 35 or 50,000 people. It doesn't seem that they put that together. So, not that you couldn't do it, but just as I understand it, the more pieces a puzzle has, a lot longer it's going to take to put it together. So maybe no one's been motivated enough to figure those out yet. But as I said, also the manpower on the ark kind of really points towards the lower number, probably. So then our last question of the night, how did we get all of the species we have today and ended up where they are today? Because as we mentioned, each of those animals only exists in the separate continents and island chains and all of that. So it's really, a lot of it helps is with the literal Bible model. It's only been about 4,000-ish years, as we studied this morning, since the flood. And as to where, as we mentioned before, everything was all pieced together as Pangea, and then it slowly spreads out to what it is today after that. And I say slowly in terms of probably our lifetime. Geologically, it'd be a lot faster than a lot of scientists want to give it credit for, because again, they don't believe in the flood, but it being closer together would have been much faster to get between islands, and then also the climate after the flood would have still left lower land bridges between continents to get across between them, such as the one in the Bering Strait. And in the biblical model, this all happens quickly over maybe a couple of hundreds of years, as opposed to the few millions of years that scientists want to use in their timeline that I have up there on the screen. And then as the animals spread out, they would have then needed to adapt to their different environments, becoming more specialized into each region where they were. For example, representatives of the canine kind, or like a dog that would have gone north and cold, would have needed thicker, longer fur, bigger torsos to stay warm. Generally, any of them that were born with short hair would have quickly died by being too cold. And so then the full population of different expressions of the canine kind became just this part that then we kind of know as the wolf or Arctic fox, coyotes, those kinds of things. Whereas alternatively, those who went to south or more warm climates would have kept genetic expressions that would have helped them survive in warm climates, such as easier way to lose heat, maybe thinner coats, such as the dingo or the African wild dog and jackal. So again, out of your original this much genetic expression they could have had, they kept this part, and all the other guys died out because they didn't like it there. So this is a lot faster in the creation model than most evolutionists want to go with in their models, because we're not looking for any big spontaneous beneficial mutations in the genetic code. All of the genetics was there at the beginning and in the kind, and then it just gets separated down into separate packets at each area of specialization. So death, as any nature show will tell you, death can come quickly in the wild, so it tends to move much faster. And also with that, one last point, generally a lot of the times people refer to great extinction events in history, and non-Christians they say an asteroid wiped out the dinosaurs, whereas most Christians say, hey, the flood killed a lot of stuff. But the thing is, the flood is very specifically not a extinction event. God made sure that some of each kind did survive on the ark. But once they got off the ark, they were no longer protected. As you can imagine, when the carnivore animals got hungry after that and they needed to eat, if they got to a kind before it reproduced, or if they ate all of them at the beginning, then that was extinction. Same for if some of them were then bothering and preying on the humans and hunting them, they might have gotten run out of existence pretty quickly. But that it wasn't any, the flood itself did not create an extinction, just as a point there as we're wrapping up our talking about the animals. Because in fact, even today, species are still dying off from those same pressures. So it's just a lot easier when you only have two than when you have a larger population. All right, so having examined our three questions that we set out to look at tonight regarding the animals in Noah's Ark, we looked at how they got to the ark, how they would have been able to fit on the ark and be carried, and how did they end up as they are after the flood. So we come to the point in our evening where we offer an invitation, and God cared deeply for the animal part of his creation there in building the ark and having the ark built. He spent close to 100 years building it and making sure that each different kind made it to the boat and was saved. But there in Matthew 6, Jesus points out that we're much more valuable to God even than that. That he gives his own son for us, and he desires all of us to be saved there in 1 Timothy 2. So please, if you haven't yet, we beg of you tonight that you would believe and come forward. We can help you with baptism, or if you have been saved but need prayers, please come forward as we stand and sing.